Good afternoon, Western Civ 2. We're continuing our discussion of the 1950s, looking at the early civil rights movement in the United States. And we'll talk about ways in which the rest of the world was following some similar paths later on. But we're looking here about African Americans and the civil rights movement in the 50s in this discussion. In 1950, there were 15 million black citizens of the United States, 2/3 of whom made their homes in the South, the old states of the old Confederacy in the American South. So 2/3 of American blacks in 1950 lived in the South. And in the South, they were often victimized by laws known as Jim Crow laws. Now, they're called Jim Crow laws. In case you're ever curious as to what Jim Crow refers to, it refers to a cartoon character that I believe was popular in the 1890s, and it was a kind of buffoonish African-American character, kind of a foolish, ill-educated black man that was a cartoon character. And these laws were sort of aimed at controlling blacks by whites, made by white legislators who had a very low opinion of African Americans. So that's why they're called that. They thought they were controlling people like the fictional character Jim Crow. But of course, what they really were doing was attempting to run the lives of black Americans. Jim Crow laws started coming into being in the 1880s and had become common all over the American South in all kinds of ways by the 1890s. Reconstruction was long over by the 1890s, and these laws were passed. Jim Crow laws, for example, forbade blacks to use public accommodations that were set aside for whites, meaning restaurants, movie theaters, when movie theaters came in a little bit later, hotels, train cars. These laws, these Jim Crow laws, segregated blacks and whites and forbade blacks to use public accommodations that were reserved for whites. And these things were all over the American South. You found a few in northern states, but they were extremely common, ubiquitous in the American South from the 1890s right into the 1950s. And that will be one target, Jim Crow laws, when the civil rights movement of African Americans begins to take off in the 1950s. Another related idea, segregation idea, it's not technically Jim Crow because it doesn't relate to public accommodation, it relates to public education, was segregated public schools. Now, most constitutions of southern states did require a free public education for people of the state, and the 14th Amendment had defined blacks as citizens of the United States, so they had to provide them with a free education. But in every southern state, the white legislators, and we're talking about entirely white state legislatures, all white governors, for decades and decades in the American South because of voting rights restrictions. But the separate education systems had come into being, again, by the 1890s. And there would be a black school and a white school, sometimes just a few blocks apart in southern cities. Black kids were forbidden to attend the white schools, no matter how conveniently located they were, and so on. And it was a simple, obvious truth that the white schools were vastly better educational institutions than the black schools. The teachers there, of course, all had attended white universities. The universities were also all segregated in the American South. The finest schools in the state were all white institutions. The teachers graduate from them. They're better qualified to teach. But not only that, the physical buildings were better buildings. The laboratories were better equipped. In every way, the white schools were superior to the black schools, largely because of funding issues. The black schools were hopelessly underfunded compared to the white schools in every jurisdiction throughout the American South. So that was the state of life for African Americans in the South in 1950. A movement will begin to do away with Jim Crow and segregated education in the 1950s. One moment that is often sort of tagged as a consciousness-raising moment for African Americans in the South was the murder of Emmett Till. Emmett, E-M-M-E-T-T, Emmett Till, T-I-L-L. Emmett Till was a young man. I believe he was 14 years old at the time. He was visiting relatives in Mississippi. He actually lived in Chicago. His family had been part of the great migration of African Americans who had begun moving to the major northern cities after the turn of the 20th century and continued after World War II at a great pace, these movements of blacks out of the South to the northern cities. Well, Till had been growing up in Chicago, but he came back to Mississippi to visit relatives. While he was there, he was kidnapped by white racists, taken out and murdered. His alleged crime, the reason they killed him, was they claimed he had whistled at a white woman. You know, a wolf whistle kind of, you know, oh, she's attractive kind of thing that men used to do back then and hopefully don't do much anymore. But that was why he deserved to die, because he was a black male, even if he was 14, who supposedly had found a white woman attractive. Incidentally, historians doubt that this ever happened at all. It may have just been a rumor that these idiots got a hold of. But anyway, they murdered him, brutally murdered him, disfigured his body. It was a terrible killing. And Emmett Till's family took his body, got his body in Chicago, and they held an open casket funeral and let the world see what these racists had done to this boy. And it really was a kind of wake-up call for many African Americans that this is enough. For decades, blacks had been lynched by white racist mobs in the South. But this public funeral, the grieving over this boy's death, really struck a chord among African Americans and would be one of the things that will kick off the civil rights movement. But I'll bet when I said the early civil rights movement, probably the first thing that came to all your minds was the Montgomery bus boycott. And you'll remember that is when Rosa Parks, 1955 again, Rosa Parks, who was worked for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She was very much interested in questions of racial justice and getting fairness for African Americans. But she was tired. She did not want to get up and move to the back of that bus. The Jim Crow laws in Alabama said, you got to move to the back of the bus if you're black and surrender your seat to a white person. And a white person got in, and Rosa Parks refused to get up. The bus driver says, unless you do, I'll call the cops. She said, call them, and she got arrested. But this would spark the bus boycott. African Americans would organize themselves. They would organize a kind of informal taxi service, a little like Uber, to drive people to their work. But they refused to ride the buses of Montgomery. And when they did, they lost most of their ridership. And the cost of operating the bus line just couldn't be met by fares anymore since the blacks had stopped riding them. It was almost 100% observance of this for months. And eventually, the city of Montgomery had to give in and give up on this policy of making blacks move to the back of the bus if a white passenger wanted a seat. So this was the first victory, you might say, against one of these Jim Crow laws, 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. One of the people who had been instrumental in organizing it was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So when you're doing your research, I know I've given you an assignment on King. I hope you learned something about this. But the other major event of this same period was a Supreme Court case, which was handed down in May 1954. and that is Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Mr. Brown, the named plaintiff, was picked by the NAACP and its lawyers because he had such an obvious case that he's African American, but he lived literally just across the street from a white elementary school. His daughter, obviously an African American, was going to have to go on a very long trip to get to the nearest black elementary school in Topeka. But the white school was across the street. And the only reason for this, making them have to send their girl so far away from home to go to elementary school, was a question of race, that Topeka had two separate school systems for blacks and for whites. Well, the lawyer for the NAACP that took this case to the Supreme Court was a man named Thurgood Marshall. He would eventually become the first black associate justice on the United States Supreme Court. Lyndon Johnson will appoint him to the court in the mid-1960s. And he would become our first black Supreme Court justice, our first non-white Supreme Court justice, Thurgood Marshall. But Marshall used a new idea to win this case. The Supreme Court had said, based on cases back in the 1890s, that there could be separate black and white public institutions, like public schools. The Supreme Court in the 1890s had said it was okay as long as those black and white institutions were separate but equal. Separate but equal was the language they said was what it was required to be constitutional. Well, on paper, things might look equal between the black and white schools. You know, they set them up with a similar school structures and all that. But what Thurgood Marshall did is bring in facts. He brought in sociological data. He brought in material to show the court that the black schools in Topeka and throughout America were uniformly not up to the same standards as the white schools. That in fact, no separate school system in America could truly claim to be equal. In fact, Thurgood Marshall argued, and the Supreme Court accepted, separate is inherently unequal. If you have a separate and a black and white school district, you cannot have equal school districts. It just is vanishingly impossible. And the facts on the ground showed that. And the Supreme Court agreed. In Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954, the Supreme Court of the United States, in an opinion written by Chief Justice Earl Warren, struck down segregated schools, saying they were inherently unequal, and laid the groundwork, the constitutional principles that would destroy Jim Crow eventually. Now, this case was limited specifically to public schools. Now, they knew that in the real world, a Supreme Court case, it can have massive implications, but nothing can change overnight. You can't create a whole new set of schools at the snap of your fingers. So what they said was this injustice must be remedied, and their word was with all deliberate speed. Now, speed, of course, means quickly. Deliberate means thoughtfully, carefully, and deliberation takes time. So there's a certain degree in which with all deliberate speed is kind of contradicting itself. But you get the idea. They want to say, well, don't rush and do a terrible job of fixing this. Take time enough to think about it carefully and sort it out properly. But it needs to be remedied with speed, deliberate speed, but speed nonetheless. Now, that wouldn't really happen very speedily at all. 2 years after Brown versus Board of Education, virtually no school districts had been integrated in the American South. 2 years that apparently wasn't deliberate speeding, was still within the range of deliberation for their speed. But that will begin to change with Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. A group of African-American students wanted to attend the best high school in their city, Little Rock, Arkansas, which was Central High School, and it was all white. They said, Brown versus the Board of Education says we should be able to attend Central, and we want to. They took it to federal court, and the federal court agreed. The governor of Arkansas, on the other hand, knew that a lot of his white voters didn't want that integration. So he ordered them not to obey the federal court's ruling. President Eisenhower, who wasn't really interested in getting knee-deep in civil rights disputes, but he said, I cannot have the governors of my states, of our states, rejecting the orders of a federal court. The federal court always wins. Remember, we talked about the federal preemption idea. When federal and state come up against each other, feds always win as long as they have the power to do it under the Constitution. And clearly they do have the power to enforce the 14th Amendment. So he would send in, President Eisenhower would send in paratroopers. I believe they were the 82nd Airborne. And they would line the sidewalks and patrol the halls to ensure that a handful of African-American students could go to class at Central High School. And they did for much of that year. A number of them actually dropped out. It was just too tense. Can you imagine going to school where you have to be protected by armed soldiers in the hallway? So many people didn't want them there. But it established the principle that the federal government would step in to enforce equality in the education system, to enforce the principles of Brown versus the Board of Education. This is 1957. It's just a beginning, but it was a beginning. Thank you.